The most consequential economic confrontation of our current geopolitical moment is not happening in the Strait of Hormuz, nor is it playing out in the high-stakes chambers of the Security Council. It isn't unfolding in the underground bunkers where military commanders calculate their survival. It is happening in the space between two sentences spoken by two leaders in two different capital cities. One leader stood in a great hall in Beijing, backed by the full diplomatic machinery of the world's most powerful nation. The other stood at a simple podium in Ottawa, with only two cameras, no teleprompter, and a folder he closed before delivering the most critical words of his career. What has unfolded in the aftermath of these events is a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, a structural redesign of global trade that has left observers across the world stunned by its precision and its ruthlessness. Welcome to Global Truth Pulse, where we look past the headlines to the mechanics of the power shifts defining our era. I am your analyst, and today we are pulling back the curtain on how a single, cold, and meticulously prepared response has dismantled an attempt to force a new unilateral economic order. To grasp the magnitude of what we are witnessing, we have to travel back to the weeks just before the summit that shifted the tectonic plates of the North American economy. A quiet delegation had departed Washington, traveling commercial, without a press pool, without an official schedule, and checking into separate hotels in Beijing to meet in buildings that do not appear in any official registry. Within just 72 hours of those clandestine meetings, the architecture of what has emerged as the most consequential backroom agreement in North American economic history had been drawn. Canada's industrial future was on the table, yet Canada was not in the room. When the administration released its 47-page policy document, the North American Manufacturing Priority Act, the language was drafted by attorneys who understood precisely what they were constructing. The goal was explicit. Any company seeking maximum American federal tax incentives was required to locate all strategic production lines inside the United States. Not North America, but the United States. This covered everything: battery manufacturing, semiconductor fabrication, electric vehicle components, artificial intelligence infrastructure, data centers, and defense supply chain inputs. But it was Section 14, Paragraph 3, that acted as the guillotine. It offered an additional 15% tax credit to any company relocating production capacity from a USMCA partner to the United States within 18 months. They were not just pulling investment out of Canada. They were subsidizing the extraction. This was not a standard trade dispute. It was a targeted, structural redesign. Simultaneously, in a maneuver to stabilize its own economy, the other major power involved redirected a staggering $94 billion in agricultural trade. Soybeans, beef, pork, and grains, directed overnight, leaving Canada unconsulted and unnotified. Canada was not a partner in this arrangement. It was the mechanism through which two great powers had decided to serve their mutual interests. A senior advisor in Washington was quoted as saying, "Why share industrial prosperity with Canada when America can keep all of it?" This wasn't a slip. It was the framing of a new reality. This provision was written by someone who had studied the infrastructure of Ontario's electric vehicle and battery manufacturing specifically. The research corridors, the university links, and the $30 billion invested into making that region the EV capital of the continent. Within 48 hours of these agreements going public, the pressure was immediate. Major manufacturers with signed commitments in Canada began announcing they were relocating to Texas, to Arizona, or suspending their Canadian commitments indefinitely. The administration added fuel to the fire by promising that Chinese companies moving to the U.S. would receive streamlined regulatory approval, turning years of bureaucratic processes into a 90-day sprint. But then, the perspective shifts. This is where the story moves from the political theater to the calculated, cold reality of the response. We have to talk about Mark Carney. To call him a politician is to misunderstand his role. This is an economist who spent over a decade at the apex of the global financial system. guiding nations through the 2008 financial crisis with more precision than any other advanced economy, serving as the only non-British citizen to lead the Bank of England in its 300-year history, and spending 13 years at Goldman Sachs, navigating the most complex financial negotiations in the private sector. He understands that in the rooms where real decisions are made, a single word costs billions, and the most dangerous negotiators are never the ones who announce their moves loudly. When the Beijing agreements went public, Carney didn't panic, and he didn't call for a press conference to complain. He sat at his desk for 4 hours, reading every page of the North American Manufacturing Priority Act, the Agricultural Contract Framework, and the critical mineral redirection provisions. He then made 3 phone calls, not to Washington or London, but to Tokyo, Berlin, and a third capital that remains, to this day, unidentified. 48 hours after the administration returned from Beijing, Carney walked to that podium in Ottawa, flanked by flags, with no teleprompter. He told the world, Canada is not a bargaining chip, and you have misread us. It was not a plea. It was a report on a counter-offensive that had already been executed. What followed over the next 72 hours was the most coordinated economic counter-positioning by a middle-sized power in modern diplomatic history. None of these moves were announced as a package, and none were presented as retaliation, but each was framed as a routine, sovereign exercise of policy. The first move was a formal notification to the United States Trade Representative to initiate a comprehensive USMCA compliance review, specifically flagging Section 14 relocation incentives as violations of investment neutrality. This wasn't a threat. It was a procedural, legal mechanism that invoked a binding agreement the United States had signed itself. It has no scheduled resolution date, meaning it will run, it will generate findings, and those findings will carry legal weight that no diplomatic denial can override. The second move was the emergency expansion of Canada's Critical Minerals Investment Authority. A new sovereign fund, capitalized at $40 million, was established to replace the very Chinese capital that had been redirected away from Canadian mining. This was not reactive improvisation. A fund this size, with its legal framework and mandate already in place, only appears that quickly if it was prepared well before the triggering event occurred. Carney had been building this since his Tokyo phone call. The third move was the announcement of a fast-tracked industrial partnership with the European Union. This manufacturing investment corridor had been in the drafting phase for 3 months, waiting for exactly this moment, allowing the EU to secure positions in Canadian assets at a discount and giving them a direct strategic stake in the outcome. The fourth move was the cementing of preferential market access agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Canada positioned itself as the primary alternative to Chinese dominance in the critical mineral supply chain, becoming the essential partner for these 3 industrial powers, which happened to be the 4 nations most reliant on these exact materials. The fifth move was the release of a rigorous economic impact assessment. This wasn't a political document. It was prepared by independent institutions and Statistics Canada. It laid out the cold, hard numbers: $800 billion in annual bilateral trade, 3.2 million American jobs directly dependent on Canadian supply chains, and 41% of American crude oil imports with no viable alternative. This document was arithmetic, presented not to voters, but to the shareholders, CEOs, and bond market participants who actually control the levers of the economy. The sixth move was the most consequential of all. Carney personally contacted the CEOs of 11 major American corporations with deep operations in both nations. He didn't issue ultimatums. He did the math for them, outlining exactly what the relocation incentives would cost in terms of Canadian regulatory cooperation and resource access. He allowed them to perform their own financial calculation, and the result was decisive. 7 of those 11 companies publicly announced they were pausing any relocation review pending further clarity. The aftermath of the sequence has been stark. Two of the three Chinese battery manufacturers that pivoted away from Ontario have already quietly reinitiated contact with their original Canadian partners. The reason is simple. American regulatory timelines? The 90-day streamlined approval that Washington advertised turned out in practice to require the 4-year process that the regulatory framework actually mandates. The infrastructure was already there, the workforce was already trained, and the supply chain connections were already built, a reality that the tax credit could not replicate. Even the agricultural sector, which initially suffered, has seen a shift toward a more resilient architecture. Canadian canola exports, which had faced a sharp decline, found new homes in India and Indonesia within 30 days, absorbing the displaced volume at comparable price points. For the individual farmer, the person sitting in their truck in Saskatchewan, realizing they were being replaced. The pain was real and acute, but the structural result may be more durable than the arrangement it replaced, as Canada accelerated toward a more diversified market model. Meanwhile, 3 European sovereign wealth funds committed $22 billion to Canadian mining projects, essentially taking advantage of the sale the administration created. By attempting to isolate the market, the architects of the Beijing Agreement inadvertently invited a global alliance of allied capital to stake a claim in the very resources they were trying to monopolize. The defining moment of this entire confrontation occurred at a White House press briefing, when a journalist asked whether the administration had calculated what a successful compliance claim would cost American businesses. The press secretary's response was a 4-second pause, a moment of silence captured on camera. Broadcast in households across North America played directly alongside the calm, prepared statements from Ottawa. That contrast didn't require commentary. One side had prepared for the battle for months. The other had needed 4 seconds just to decide what it was permitted to say, and then chose to say nothing at all. Trump arrived in Beijing bold, loud, and certain, believing he had restructured the most integrated bilateral economic relationship in history in just 72 hours. But certainty is not the same as strategy. While the administration was posting on social media about weakness, the sovereign fund was being capitalized, the European corridor was being finalized, and the compliance review was being filed. The result of this misreading is currently costing the administration political capital and economic stability. And the only question that remains is just how expensive that lesson will ultimately be. We are watching a fundamental shift in the global order, where a middle power has successfully defended its sovereign economic future against the demands of a superpower that assumed its partner would simply submit. This isn't just about trade. It is about the reality that the world is more complex, more networked, and less forgiving of impulsive strategy than it has ever been. Does this demonstrate that the era of the unilateral bold move is ending, or are we simply seeing the first of many such confrontations in a multipolar world? The data shows the latter. If you want to stay ahead of these tectonic shifts, subscribe to Global Truth Pulse, like this video, and share it with those who need to see past the political theater. We will see you in the next one.